And even then, it's not like I'm like I'll have a little bit of a basis for my decisions or just for my own data.
Yeah, that's
I remember yesterday, I totally forgot the equation. I totally forgot even like kind of the basic intuition about how to structure the equation. And I have to get it still in my muscle memory. No, I didn't do that. It's just like muscle memory of that's not very useful.
no, but you know, it's good.
Yeah. Think like if I want to really understand the equations, like maybe really
Yeah,
well,
definitely.
but with I mean at least with the kind of stuff like cramming and stuff. I don't feel like
You're right.
for real. I actually so I actually asked him just how to do it because one of the guys who interviewed me he told me that he also went to Columbia. I forget which group he was in, which journal, but he eventually worked out something where he did some sort of work for them or something like that.
Yeah, and once they offer that,
That's the problem. Yeah. So they told me that you got to do it. So they gave me an extension.
okay, well, that's good.
Probably gonna wait the last like 3 days for that too. I pushed it back. If I remember correctly, it's about a week. And then the final draft they did the same day. Oh no, not the same day, but I mean the original.
Oh, so they moved the final draft.
No, they only moved the first half.
I mean, yeah, that's what
Yeah. I'm gonna try. I'm gonna try to like.
yeah, I know. Right?
Yeah. 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 I told you.
It's like, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
That's what someone.
I apologize for being late. I was on the phone with some folks from the Senate Banking Committee earlier there, thinking about whether to revise Dodd-Frank, about which I've done some writing, and took more time than I thought, but I apologize again. Did this print out in a screwed up way? No? Good, because I did a version of the printing of this stuff upstairs, and some of the typeface didn't come out correctly, but if it came out okay for you, then that's fine. I mean, for some of you, this is abstruse enough without it being impossible to read. All right. Today we're going to begin our discussion of modern financial theory, which will last for a couple weeks. I think everybody will get the intuitions. The TAs in the first TA session is today after class, and Sam will correct all the confusion that I've left in the wake of today's class. Anyway, so you'll get a clear idea for those who haven't done any of this before. But so we're going to spend time on what might be called modern financial theory in both kind of a theoretical and applied dimension. In part because there are some really powerful, deep ideas that will tell us and you a lot about the world and what can go wrong in the world. So one of the big ideas that we'll be addressing is the idea of diversification. That investors, when they look to invest, want not only to maximize their expected return, but to also to do so while minimizing their risk, and that they evaluate an investment in effect on what might be called a risk-adjusted basis. And that idea was the basis for, the Nobel Prize a generation and a half ago. How do you get diversification? You get diversification by assembling a portfolio of investments. Because what might be positive for one investment will be negative for another investment. But if on average the expected return of each of the investments is positive, then the portfolio as a whole, the expected return on the portfolio as a whole will be positive, but the chance of a bad outcome will be lower. So the classic story is a firm that makes suntan lotion, another firm that makes umbrellas. Each of these firms will have an expected return, that is to say, their expected earnings in a given period. But if we should have a patch of extremely rainy weather, the suntan lotion maker will be losing money, while the umbrella maker will be making extra money, or will have exceptionally high earnings. And you can reverse the story depending on which way the global warming vectors will work. But the insight is the way to achieve the same level of expected return for each of these firms, let's say, while reducing the risk of a bad outcome, is to hold equal amounts of those two stocks, because, again, in the bad state for one, it's an exceptionally good state for the other, and vice versa. So that's kind of a simple but classic story of the power of diversification, the power of investing in a portfolio style. And so if you learn nothing from this course other than that lesson, you will have, it will have been of more value to you than even the tuition for the full year will amount to, because what it teaches is that unless you think you have especially good ability to pick an individual stock or group of them, or unless you have inside information, which I know none of you will ever use to trade, because that would, if caught, your career is over. But unless you have unless you have special insight to how these firms will be run or work, or forbidden information, then the way over the long term to invest is basically a portfolio of stocks that maximizes the range of securities you own, which will minimize the risk associated with any of those securities, which is called idiosyncratic risk. And then the only issue is, how do you minimize fees? So Warren Buffett would say to most of us, what you should do is buy an index fund or an ETF and forget about anything else, because you aren't smart enough, or you haven't spent your life being able to pick stocks in a detailed firm-specific way. It's not our business as lawyers. We're not going to use inside information. And so for the general run of how we ought to save for the future or for retirement, the way to do it is the only thing we have control over is how to minimize risk. And the way to minimize risk is through diversification, and the way to achieve the best diversification is with a fund that holds all risky assets, and anything else, you may as well be buying the bitcoins and sort of, waiting for the gold dust to come out of the sky, right? So anyway, that's one of the, the personal takeaways out of this approach to thinking about risk and return that falls out of modern financial theory. All right, so a flawed approach to diversification is one of the main reasons we had the global financial crisis, which the shadow of which still overhangs each and every one of us today, right? We're still living in the shadow of that cataclysmic event in 07, 08, 09. And part of what created it was a mistake about diversification. So I'm just going to explain why, kind of to make it clear why this stuff is really important to appreciate. So when you assemble a portfolio, the basis for the risk reduction elements of diversification is that the various securities in the portfolio will respond differently to different states of the economic world. In other words, that the correlation among these investments is not 1.0. If that's the whole point of suntan lotion and umbrellas, right? Because in different states of weather, they will respond differently. But if we had two investments, which, I mean, if we had umbrellas and raincoats, if those were the two stocks, and that was the portfolio we were thinking about, the level of diversification would what? It would be very low, right? Because in response to the same event, they would respond in the same way. So if we're thinking, how do I hedge against the weather risk, if that's the real risk you're worried about, then you don't want to have umbrellas and raincoats together. I mean, if you're holding all the stocks, that's okay. But if you're only, in the little story we're telling, you don't get any diversification from holding both umbrellas and the maker of raincoats, because we would expect those stocks to respond roughly in the same way, given the weather. If it's very rainy, they both will do exceptionally well. If it's very sunny, they both will do exceptionally poorly. And so we don't get any risk reduction from that sort of diversification, right? All right, so part of the reason for the crisis was that financial institutions held a particular sort of security, mortgage-backed securities. And, to kind of compress a lot of the detailed facts, in effect, each mortgage-backed security had a claim on a mortgage from a different part of the U.S. The view was that real estate is local. All real estate is local. So therefore, if we have a housing market swoon in L.A., that won't have any effect. It won't be at all associated with housing market conditions in Manhattan or in Florida or Arizona or wherever, right? If we have mortgage claims drawn from real estate all over the U.S., then we will have achieved diversification. And even though the mortgage securities have some risk of default, because, local real estate conditions might be bad, if we assemble a mortgage-backed security that consists of mortgage claims from all over the United States, then these indeed will be very safe, right? Because we've gotten a lot of diversification because of the lack of the correlation, the independence in the returns on a mortgage from Manhattan as opposed to a mortgage from LA, right? And so the view was mortgage-backed securities, which were found on the balance sheets of many financial firms, were very safe, or could be made safe by diversification conditional on what we understood then about how the real estate market worked. All right. What we discovered, to our deep regret, is that this sort of mortgage finance, assembling mortgage-backed securities, sold in very favorable rates of return because they supposedly had very little risk, changed real estate markets throughout the United States, and where formerly markets were separate, the correlation was very low, independence of returns was very high. The fact that we had changed the nature of real estate finance through this financial innovation meant that, for the first time, real estate prices had a correlation that was very high. So instead of the Manhattan and the LA markets being different, detached, independently responding to local conditions, the very proliferation of mortgage-backed securities and the overall effect it had on real estate values throughout the United States created a correlation where one had previously not existed. And so instead of the mortgage-backed securities being a very safe investment, very low risk for the expected return because of the diversification, they became much riskier than anticipated because the theory of diversification failed. And so whereas previously we expected these markets to respond differently to local conditions because they were responding to local conditions which would be different in LA than Manhattan, because of the power of this tool in shaping real estate finance throughout the United States, we created conditions that were uniform across the U.S. We destroyed the independence on the basis of which the assumption of diversification and thus safety was based. And instead we added the correlation here, which made these much riskier than anticipated. And, you know, again, to compress a lot, the crisis was in part a result of that. Banks and others had much riskier assets on their balance sheet that they anticipated, and thus the default risk was much higher than they anticipated. And, you know, when you're dealing with highly leveraged financial institutions, greater than anticipated losses could quickly put those firms, push those firms over the edge. And that in a sort of, you know, that's certainly one account of the way the crisis unfolded. And the point that, I mean, the reason I, you know, bring it up now is to sort of motivate the idea that some of the intuitions here are important not only for your personal investing, but also the macro effects of failing to understand the conditions of diversification are quite significant. All right, so one element of theory: diversification, risk, return, etc. We're going to push out some elements to use modern financial theory to quantify some of the claims, normative claims that are made about M&A law. So, for example, is a charter amendment that the firm adopts that makes it harder for a bidder to succeed, such as a classified board, is such a shark repellent amendment a good thing or a bad thing from the shareholder point of view? So we could have, I mean, there are two different theories about this, right? A shark repellent amendment which slows down a bidder, hostile bidder, a bidder who proceeds over the objections of the management team, is, well, let me ask one of you. What would be a theory that such an amendment would be a good thing from a shareholder point of view? Who's got an idea about that? What would be the theory as to how that would be a good thing from a shareholder point of view? A shark repellent amendment. How would you make that case in just a few words? Ideas? Tiffany Shee. Tiffany, what do you think? The mic.
Maybe that wouldn't interfere with companies' long-term strategy?
Because what? I mean, in what way?
Say, like in the Time Warner case, they already have a like a 10-year strategy that like, they're gonna merge with another company, and if they have like some kind of tactics in place to fend off like other hostile bidders, maybe their strategy can continue to succeed.
All right, protect a well worked out positive strategy, but why? Except isn't the missing piece? Why wouldn't the shareholders appreciate it? So if the bidder had well worked out, sorry, if the target management had a well worked out strategy that was going to maximize the value of the firm, why wouldn't the shareholders appreciate that and refuse to vote for to vote in the case of a well, I guess in the case of a tender offer, refuse to sell their shares? Why wouldn't that be the way the shareholders would respond?
Why wouldn't the shareholder? Can you please repeat your question?
I mean, why does the board need to worry about the shareholder response if it's got a good plan in place?
Because the shareholder essentially owns the company, so
The shareholders...
owns the company. That's why they have to care about what shareholder thinks.
Well, that's why, as a mechanical matter, they need to do it. But what's the case that the firm would make that the shark repellent amendment that makes it harder for the bidder to succeed is actually what the shareholders ought to want?
Is it because that the board of directors, they have more they're more professional in deciding the future of the company because they're
Right. I guess it's the board knows more than the shareholders know, and yet the shareholders, or at least a majority of them, will respond to the short-term incentives of a premium price, and in effect, the board is exerting a paternalistic belief, paternalistic pressure, counter pressure to the bidder, and actually the shareholders, and therefore a mechanism that prevents the stampeding of the shareholders is a good thing and will maximize the stock price, right? You might think of there being some sort of prisoner's dilemma story in which, and indeed we'll come across cases where the bid is constructed in a way to be coercive, but you might think in a more general way their prisoner dilemma story in which the individually rational thing for the shareholder to do is to sell, even if the collectively rational thing for the shareholders to do is not to sell, and the shark repellent amendment in a way protects the board's ability to prevent the shareholders from acting in a collectively irrational way. All right? So that would be a theory as to why the shark repellent amendment, as to why the classified board amendment might be good from a shareholder point of view. What would be the counterclaim that the shark repellent amendment is a bad thing? What would be the counter?
that the shareholders can decide for themselves.
And therefore, what does the shark repellent amendment do?
It basically impedes the shareholder from making their own choices.
Right, but it's managerial entrenchment, right? The shark repellent amendment is kind of agency costs, in the phrase probably you're familiar with, that it's an entrenchment strategy by the management team, which for its own personal motives wants to remain in control of Target. And therefore, it's putting in place a governance device that prevents the shareholders from acting. And the view would be, well, the shareholders can figure out for themselves what makes sense, right? So there are different normative views as to whether, or back up, there are arguments as to whether a shark repellent amendment is a good thing for the shareholders on average or a bad thing for the shareholders on average. Rather, the view is rather than just fight this out as a matter of theory, wouldn't it be nice to have empirical evidence as to whether on average such entrenchment measures are a good thing for the shareholders or whether on average they're a bad thing for the shareholders? Do they increase shareholder welfare or reduce shareholder welfare? All right, so we now have, we'll develop an empirical methodology, a technology that will let us generate empirical evidence on these questions. That is to say, this is what we'll get to when we discuss event studies. And the methodology in brief is to look at the performance of the stock, look at stock price changes after the announcement of a particular measure, and see if stock price goes up or goes down. And so if announcement of the putting in place of a target defensive measure increases the stock price and therefore increases the value of the firm from the point of view of the market cap of the firm, the overall market value of the firm, that would tend to favor the idea that the shark repellent amendment or the defensive measure is shareholder protective against some form of coercive pressure on the shareholders to sell, even where collectively it would be better not to sell. In the alternative, if the stock price goes down, that would lend support to the idea that the defensive measure is entrenchment. It would reduce the welfare of the shareholders, and management's goals in putting it in place is self-regarding goals. And so the technology, there are lots of issues involved. Presumably we don't want to look at just one firm that undergoes a measure of this sort. We want to collect a portfolio of firms. We're concerned about factors that might be affecting the firm's stock price on a given day in addition to the shark repellent amendment, factors that are firm-specific, factors that relate to the market as a whole. And part of what we're going to be exploring when we look at, again, event study methodology is in effect how do some of these issues get resolved. But the point is that there is a lot of empirical evidence that has been developed about the contested positions in the M&A area. And, as I said before, part of what ought to be in the lawyer's toolbox is some way to access that evidence, not just for the public policy debates that we'll be involved in, but also because the courts will accept that evidence when they are trying to grapple with some of the difficult issues that they themselves want to resolve. All right, so that's the part of the general pitch for some of the modern financial theory stuff that we're going to be doing. So let's turn to some of the material specifically for today. So the initial idea that we're going to discuss is, in effect, the time value of money. and present value. Now, the time value of money is really a function of the fact of compound interest. I think this is just kind of the simplest way to think of it. So if you put money in the bank and you'll earn a positive rate of interest, right? And so the amount that you'll get at the end of the holding period will be not just the initial deposit, but also the interest that you're earning while the money is left in the bank. And that's not only the interest on the initial amount that you put in, but the interest on the prior period's amount plus the interest that had accrued in that prior period. So basically, let's imagine that that you've got $100, and the interest rate is, to make the math easy, is 10%. That would be great, right? Or it would be terrible. If short-term rates were that, then, you know, that would not be a good state of the world, but the math is easier. So, at the end of the year, you're going to have $100 plus the $10 that you've earned, and so you have $110. At the end of year 2, how much are you going to have? You're going to earn the 10% not just on the initial amount that you deposited, the $100, but the amount initially deposited plus the interest that had accrued over that period. So this is year 1. In year 2, you're going to be earning a 10% rate of return on the total amount that's now in the bank. And that will proceed as long as you have the money in the bank. The compounding is the interest rate on not only the initial deposit, but on prior amounts of accrued interest. And that will produce at the end of the period what in some texts is called the terminal value. In other texts is called the forward value. It's the same thing. And so one way to think of this, you know, in your own lives is assume that you want to save for your tuition, right? One way to put this in your head, the time value of money, is, you know, at the end of the and maybe it's not you, let's say your parents are saving for your college tuition, right? And they're starting when you're a tot, and let's say they're thinking of themselves for a 15-year period, and they want to get to a goal of $50,000 a year, of $50,000 total. I realize, you know, that doesn't buy much tuition these days, but so they want to get to a terminal amount of $50,000. So one way of thinking of the amount, the financing issue that they face is how much money do they need to put in the bank, given a rate of interest, so that at the end of the period, it's reached $50,000. And to make it simple, let's imagine that there's a grandparent who wants to give a, sort of a fixed sum at the time the kid is born, so that at the end of the 18-year period, he or she will have $50,000 to apply to college, right? So that's the issue, exactly the simple issue that we've got. How, given the rate of interest, how much does the grandparent need to put in the bank today, so that in 18 years, the terminal value, the forward value of $50,000 will be achieved, right? So that's to think about the time value of money in a forward direction. We can also think about the time value of money kind of in the reverse direction. And let's just, again, the college tuition example. Assume that we know that we're going to receive $50,000 in 18 years. What is the present value of that $50,000 today? Right? We're given an investment choice that says, I'll give you $5,000 today, or in 18 years, $50,000. How do you begin to think about that? How do you begin to think about that choice? And what you realize is that to make the decision, and this is probably, it's too easy a case, right? I mean, we should have had like 14,750, right? That'll be harder. Basically, when you try to compute the present value, that's the term of the $50,000, you're promised to get it in 18 years. What is it worth today? What's the present value of the $50,000 to be received in 18 years? Well, in a sense, it's the reverse of the terminal value of the forward value, because basically we're asking yourselves, how much money do we need to put in the bank today to produce $50,000 in the 18 years? And that, in effect, is the present value of the that is the present value of the $50,000 to be received in 18 years. So it's sort of a nice way to get your hands around the idea of present value, which is the value today of money to be received in the future, to realize that there is, in effect, mechanically working out of the same idea of how much money do we need to put in the bank. All right, so let's just add a little texture to it. Let's just look at to show the impact. What determines the present value, right? So basically, we know that we're going to get the $50,000 in 18 years. Right? Assume we know that with certainty. the payoff is really going to work. What is the feature that determines the present value of the 50,000? What is the critical feature that determines the present value of the 50,000? So let's see. So is Kyle. Okay, so Kyle, what is the critical feature? The interest rate. I mean, could you say why that would be?
Like theoretically or in the formula?
Well, theoretically.
I suppose the idea is you could be depositing money in the bank instead. And so, like with the future value, the interest rate's important to know what you could have instead, almost like opportunity cost. And you know that from the formula because you're dividing by the interest rate instead of multiplying that.
Right. So in effect, let's take a look at the table here. Did everybody have the table? I asked you to bring it because it's sort of like it's an easy thing to do. So so Kyle, how would we compute? I mean, assume that the rate of interest is, say, it's a 5% rate of interest. What is the present value? And let's say what's the present? How would you determine from the table here the present value of $50,000 in 18 years?
So would you not you'd go to the 18th year,
Okay.
go to the 5% column,
Okay.
and then I suppose, so this is all for $1, right?
Right,
So
exactly.
I suppose you would multiply that number by 50,000.
Okay, so 50,000 times 0.46. So that's roughly it's $20,000 in change, right? So that's the present value of 50,000 at a 5% rate. All right. What happens if the rate of interest goes up? How does that affect the present value? Assuming we have an 8% rate of interest.
Then it would go down, right?
Well, all right.
8%
And
interest.
so mechanically, we go to the 8% column. So we see it's the present value of a single dollar to be received in 18 years. The present value today of a single dollar to be received in 18 years is 25 cents. So basically, we have 50,000 times 0.25, which is something like 12,000.
12,500.
Yeah, 12.5, right? So that present value is less. Now, so just thinking out of this simple example, there are a couple of powerful intuitions here, right? So if you're thinking about how much money the grandparent needs to put in the bank to achieve the $50,000 goal at the end of the 18-year period, if the interest rate is higher, then guess what? He or she will need to put in less money. Only $12,500 to at the 8% rate to get to the $50,000 forward amount or terminal amount But that also means, the flip of that is that the present value of the $50,000 to be received in 18 years, assuming a discount rate, as that's the term of art, of 8% is $12,005. If the interest rate were lower, at 5%, the present value would be $20,000. Now, this has got important implications for investments, for your own investments. So, so assume that you had bought a treasury bond now that was going to mature in 18 years. And the face amount of the treasury bond is $50,000, right? The present value of that bond is roughly $20,000. That's how much you would need to pay today to buy that bond. That's how much, or to flip it, that's how much today you could sell that bond for, right? And so this is, this is not so very different than the interest rate that an 18-year bond would require today. What happens if, because of burgeoning government deficits, the U.S. government needs to pay a higher rate of interest to attract buyers for the greater volume of Treasury securities that it will need to issue to cover the government debt? What does that do for the value of the bond that you bought today for the 18-year maturity? What does it do? So,
the bond would be worth, well, I suppose you're paying...
Suppose the rate of interest were to go up to 8%, to pick a number.
Then it's worth less today to purchase.
Well, how much less?
It's worth $7,500 less.
Right, exactly right. I mean, in other words, the fact that the interest rates have gone up, prevailing 18-year interest rates have gone up from 5% to 8%, because the government needs to pay a higher rate of interest to fund the amount of debt that it wants to fund. What that does is anybody who's holding a treasury bond today will suffer a loss in the value of that bond, the amount that he or she could realize for that bond upon a sale, from $20,000 to $12.5. And that's because, again, think about it in present value terms. The present value of $50,000 to be received in 18 years is lower if interest rates are higher. And that's a very important idea. If interest rates are higher, the present value of money to be received in the future will go down. And the reason for that, again, the core intuition is because, in effect, the amount of money that you need to put in the bank today to get to the $50,000 is going to be less at a lower rate of interest, less at a higher rate of interest than at a lower rate of interest. And they're that accordion, those are linked. It's like these are two pieces that work exactly with one another. And sort of like, when I discuss it with folks who don't come with their, the MBA degree, right? The issue as to why the present value of the bond should go down when interest rates go up, that's it seems counterintuitive at first blush. But if you think of present value in effect being the amount of money you got to put in the bank today to achieve target amount at the end of a period, then you can see why, if interest rates go up, the amount that you got to put in the bank today will go down, and therefore the present value of the amount to be received in the future will also go down. Everybody has the intuition about how much do I got to put in the bank to get to my target goal. What's maybe the intuition that doesn't follow for everybody is the idea that that means the present value is going to be linked in exactly the same way. All right, so now there's a in the materials, there's a nice little picture that gets some of this intuition. Right, so figure 3.6, this is on page 11 of our revised chapter. In a way, this is how money growth is affected by a change in interest rate. But as you know, as interest rates go up, the amount that you'll get at the end will go down. Sorry, as interest rates go up, the amount you get at the end will go up. But the flip of that is interest rates go up, the present value of the same amount that you receive at the end will go down. All right, so let's discuss annuities, which is table 5.2. So, and that's the challenge there, is to think about a stream of income. And I put a reading for those of you who are baseball fans. The contract of Max Scherzer. It's a nice kind of story. Often, sports figures will receive a contract for a number of years, and they'll the number will be huge, right? 350. What did Scherzer get? Scherzer got. It was right. It's $210 million, right? That was the headline, and people think, well, that's a lot of money. It is a lot of money, no matter how you slice it, right? But how much money is it really? And this is a really important question for lawyers, right? Because, in a minute I'll say why. But I mean, if you're the baseball owner, how much money is that really, right? And what you're going to want to know is, what's the present value of the $210 million? Or if you're an agent and you're bargaining for another player who wants the same present value, but is prepared to structure the arrangements differently, right? And so part of what you'll see in agreements of this sort is the effort to create a headline number that is big and glorious, because that satisfies the ego of all the parties involved. The player, the agent, maybe the owner, because he or she can say to the fans, look at all the money I'm spending to try to improve this team, so buy a season ticket at the inflated prices over last year, right? But the issue is, what is this really costing? And the only, or how do I compare the agreement that Scherzer gets with the agreement that maybe Tanaka gets, right? And part of it is when is the money actually paid? Because in effect, what we're trying to do is to compare Tanaka's deal with Scherzer's deal, or there should be a soccer analogy, but I don't follow soccer enough to come up with the right players to compare, and I apologize for my parochialism there. Or basketball, right? The question is, when is the money coming in? And so what we see in Scherzer's case is that he gets a fixed amount payable in the year in which he is expected to pitch, but then there's money that's back-loaded on an annual basis. So in a nominal sense, he gets $35 million a year, but actually $15 million of that is kind of to be received at some point in the future. And what we know is that if we're trying to compute the present value of that deal to compare his deal with some other deal, we need to first to evaluate, in effect, the fixed stream that he gets on an annual basis, and then take account as well of the backload money. How long does he have to wait for that money? And it's only when we assess the value of the stream to be received, plus provide the right discount for the backloaded stream, that we can compute the present value. And so basically, here the assessment is the present value of the $210 million is when they really work it out, it's more like $120 million, I think, which is still not bad, but it's roughly half of what the headline amount was. And the reason I say this is highly relevant for lawyers is because lawyers, suppose you have a client who had who was in a bad accident, and he or she is going to need medical care and support his or her whole life, right? So, in effect, what you'll get is what's called a structured settlement, in which the insurer will pay out a certain amount on an annual basis over the expected life of the client, let's say. And so, in effect, in comparing how much you're getting, is that a good deal for the client or not? How do I compare the deal I've negotiated for this client with my competitor's deal for another client in similar circumstances? What you're trying to compute is the present value of that income stream, with whatever delays in the receipt of the money might be part of the settlement with the insurer. Right, so therefore, figuring out the annuity payment here, table 5.2, is very important. So an annuity is, in effect, a fixed payout. And the question is, how do we compute, in effect, a fixed payout to be received at the end of a year, which, again, the crucial variable here is the interest rate on this. And so, all right, so a nice way to illustrate this, the importance of this, is let's take the lottery. So let's imagine that you stop by one of the tobacconists and you buy a lottery ticket, and the lottery payoff is $500 million. Now, what does it mean for the $500 million payoff? Well, I mean, assume it's got a 25-year payout period. Make sure the 25-year payout period, and 25 into 500 million goes 20 million a year. Okay, so what we know is that the present value of the lottery payout is not $500 million, right? I mean, we know that because we don't get the money all at once. We get it paid out only only $20 million a year. So, Kyle, using the annuity table, how are we going to figure out what the present value of that payout is? And in particular, if we're offered a particular lump sum alternative to the payout, how are we going to evaluate the lump sum, evaluate the choice between the lump sum on the one hand and receiving the income stream on the other? So how do we go about that?
Well, first we need the interest rate again, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay. Which is?
So what would be, I mean, assume we have a 5% rate of interest. What would be the present value of the $20 million payout stream? This is for a 25-year period.
The present value then would be whatever. So the annuity chart is not relevant to this then, right? Like we just need the present value chart. We don't need the annuity chart for this.
No,
part,
no,
right?
because you need the annuity chart because we're going to be receiving a fixed payout of $20 million a year for a 25-year period. And what we want to know is how do we compute the present value of that?
So I imagine if you look at the chart,
right,
under 5% interest rate, you have 14.1.
Okay.
So I imagine you wouldn't multiply 20,000 by that, 20 million by that. So you probably have to divide. Oh, you just moved the decimal over? Is that
Yeah, it's 14.1 times 20 million. Right, and so basically, it's
I got you. I have it.
it's 280 million, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Just about.
So we basically know, conditional on an interest rate of 5%, that the present value of the jackpot paid out 20 million a year over 25 years is only, and I'm putting only in quotes, $280 million. So if we, I wish you all very good luck in your, lottery picks, and if you happen to win this one, remember this class well, and, the law school will appreciate that. Anyway, all right, so it's a present value of $280 million. Notice how sensitive it is to the interest rate that we assume will be the relevant one, the discount rate, the prevailing rate of interest that we assume we'll obtain over the entire period. Because if we were to assume that the right discount rate, the right interest rate to use is today's, well, I mean, you might ask, what is today's rate on a 25-year Treasury bond? That would be a way you might ask, where does the interest rate come from? You might say, well, look, a Treasury bond has zero risk of repayment. It's for sure going to pay. The 25-year rate, let's assume, is not 5%, but 3%. What does that do to the present value?
It's going to increase.
Exactly right. In the same way that we discussed before. So basically, the 3% rate is 17.4 times 20 million. So that's going to take it to roughly $350 million. And so let's assume that we're offered a lump sum. You take this payout, the $20 million a year for 25 years, or you're offered a lump sum of $300 million. Which should you choose, right? In effect, you're asking yourself, what is the present value of the 350? Well, the 300 million that you know. How does that compare to the present value of the income stream that I'm going to be getting from the lottery payout? If you think that the right rate of interest is the Treasury rate, the 3%, the income stream, the present value of the income stream is greater than the lump sum, the 300 million that you're offered. If you think the right rate of interest, the discount rate, is the 5%, then which generates a present value of 280, then you think that the lump sum is definitely the way to go. And so, in a sense, this choice, which again, it's perfect. It's perfectly. I mean, you see this occurring in the press all the time, right? The choice between, do I take the fixed payout or do I take the lump sum? The fixed payout is going to occur with certainty. There isn't any risk, let's assume. And it's really, from a financial point of view, it's just really a choice of what do you think the right rate of interest is for this period of time. And again, it's a little bit about a bet which way you think the interest rates in the economy are going to go. That's kind of the basis for the bet. The empirical evidence, of course, and this is this is a behavioral claim rather than a financial claim, right? Most people take the lump sum. They pay less attention to the present value of the payout over time, which often is, in fact, higher than the lump sum that's being offered, because the state's got to write the check for for the $300 million today. As with many states, it would rather write a smaller check over, some other governor's administration to worry about it. Because behaviorally, people have a hard time thinking about the future, right? And this is a kind of a powerful insight, but sometimes hard to know what to do with, right? In order to decide to take the payout stream, you have to really have a deep faith in sort of the future in a certain way that maybe works in finance theory but doesn't always work in personal life. So anyway, so from a finance point of view, we know exactly the way to compare and contrast these things. And in theory, you ought to be able to convert whichever is the higher, that is to say, the lump sum or the payout stream into one or the other, right? Because if you take the lump sum, but really think I should really, I don't want to spend this money all at once, I'll in effect buy a payout stream, but you know, I'll buy a payout stream, or I've got the payout stream, I'll buy the lump sum. I mean, that would be the logical finance way to think of it, but behavior that we see with the lottery is sometimes different from that. All right, so tomorrow we're going to go forward. We're going to do some of the questions following Chapter 2. We're going to go into 3, which is, again, all about risk. The syllabus has got the assignments. So, and so we'll move forward on this material. And, again, there's a TA session right following this class. And, I mean, I hope the folks who didn't come with intuitions about this material are kind of getting some. That's the point. See you tomorrow.
Everyone, the TA session is in 102B, so it's next door. We'll start in about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Good. Hi.
I'm Stanley. I'm in your class, in your contemporary corporate law scholarship class. So I'm an LM student, and this is my last semester here. So I'm thinking about to make an extended paper for one of the paper that you requested for your seminar. Is it possible? So, and
You mean as a supervised writing?
yeah, because I understand that the requirement is the extended paper should be like up to 10 pages.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, well, that's, you mean for me?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right.
But then, because
Well, the only problem with that is that, I mean, my understanding is that the supervised writing is supposed to be a research paper, right? So which is different from what I'm asking students to do, which is not research, is to sort of read the piece and then sort of think about it and ask questions and stuff. So it's the opposite of research. I mean, I'm not expecting you to have to do any research, right? So it's really kind of a different thing. Where are you from? Right. And so, what are the stuff you're interested in doing? I mean, have you been a lawyer for a while, or? Right, exactly. So, I mean, is there a topic that seems to engage you in a comparative sense about Indonesia and the United States? Yeah. discuss, I don't think we're going to be discussing it in the seminar, but if you wanted to write about that, you know, that could be the basis for paper, right? In other words, you could sort of do a comparative study of hostile bids in Indonesia and the U.S. Indeed, maybe the activist shareholder in Indonesia versus the U.S. And of course, that would entail a discussion of the difference in the ownership structure in Indonesia versus the U.S. and also maybe other description as to how the board is set up, the independence of directors, who elects the directors. In other words, I think it would be perhaps a worthwhile thing to compare the corporate governance of Indonesia with that of the U.S. on some critical dimension and maybe try to predict whether you think that Indonesian pattern is going to be stable or not, or whether there are institutional investors who will come into Indonesia who will insist on differences. You know, that would be a possible thing for you to write about if you wanted to, you know. I mean, what you should do is kind of sketch out kind of, you know, a research goal or how you would proceed. And